The first time I saw a human, I thought it was defective. It was smaller than expected, standing upright on two legs, its smooth pinkish-brown skin exposed except for primitive wrappings of fabric. It should have been cowering, trembling in fear, like all lesser species when in the presence of a superior being like myself. But it wasn't afraid. It was watching, studying. Its eyes were the most unsettling part. Dark, focused, unwavering. I had seen countless creatures in my time as a collector, from the towering amphibioid war beasts of Jekkar to the glass-skinned song creatures of Varnis 9. Most living things followed predictable instincts: fear, aggression, submission. But this human, it did not flinch, did not shrink back. It simply stood there, unbound, unrestrained, staring at me with that unreadable expression. I tapped a command into my wrist module, activating the containment field around its enclosure. The blue energy flickered to life, crackling softly as it solidified into an impenetrable barrier. The human's gaze flicked toward it for the briefest moment before returning to me. "Observe the specimen," I muttered to my ship's log, my voice calm and practiced. Despite lacking natural armor, defensive weaponry, or enhanced musculature, it exhibits an unusual lack of fear. This is inconsistent with prior reports of its species being highly adaptable but non-threatening. I stepped closer, my elongated form towering over the enclosure. The human had no bioluminescent markers, no shifting chromatophores, no natural pheromone signatures that I could detect. Most intelligent species relied on some form of instinctive communication: fear scent, submissive posture, threat displays. This one simply was. I decided to test it. With a flick of my claw, I altered the gravity field inside the enclosure, increasing it to twice the standard planetary force of its homeworld. A simple enough test. Many creatures panicked when their physical autonomy was disrupted. Some collapsed instantly, their bodies unable to adjust. I expected the human to struggle, to fall to its knees. It widened its stance, shifted its weight, adjusted. It did not fall. I narrowed my eyes, increasing the pressure further, 3 times normal gravity. It gritted its teeth, a muscle twitching in its jaw, but still, it did not collapse. I could see the strain in its limbs, but there was something else, something that sent a chill through me. It was enduring. That was not the reaction of a passive creature. It was the reaction of something that refused to break. I released the field, restoring normal gravity. The human let out a breath, rolling its shoulders, but never looked away from me. I was suddenly aware that it had been watching me as much as I had been watching it, calculating, measuring. For the first time in my long years as a collector, I felt the stirrings of unease. I had expected an exotic pet, something novel, something entertaining. Instead, I had found something else entirely, and I wasn't sure I liked it. At first, I treated it like any other exotic acquisition. My collection spanned hundreds of species from dozens of worlds, each carefully catalogued and housed in the finest conditions. I prided myself on my ability to acclimate even the most skittish of creatures, to mold them into docile, manageable specimens. I saw no reason why this human would be any different. I provided it with everything it could need. The enclosure was climate-controlled, its environmental settings calibrated precisely to mimic the conditions of its homeworld. The bedding was soft, the light levels adjustable. I even went so far as to introduce various forms of entertainment, holographic projections of what I assumed were familiar landscapes, primitive puzzles meant to engage its problem-solving instincts. None of it worked. The human sat in the corner, unmoving, arms crossed over its chest. It refused the food I provided, ignoring the nutrient-dense pastes and fresh produce imported from its own system. At first, I thought it simply didn't recognize the offerings, so I replicated the meals, exactly as recorded in my database. Meat, grains, even artificially synthesized versions of the crude beverages its species consumed. It remained untouched. Most creatures, when deprived of sustenance, quickly become desperate. Hunger erodes defiance, replaces it with the simple, primal need to survive. I had seen it happen countless times. Eventually, instincts override stubbornness, but the human was patient. Too patient, it did not pace, did not cry out, did not exhibit any of the normal stress behaviors I had come to expect from intelligent lifeforms in captivity. Instead, it sat, watching, calculating. I increased the pressure, lowered the temperature, slightly, just enough to cause discomfort, but not harm. Adjusted the oxygen levels, made it clear that cooperation would be rewarded with stability. Still, it did not break. That was when I activated the neural compliance device. It was a simple mechanism, one that had been used effectively on dozens of other species. A harmless pulse designed to create a sense of unease and disorientation. Nothing painful, nothing cruel, just a subtle nudge toward obedience. Lesser beings always succumbed quickly, their survival instincts compelling them to submit. The human clenched its jaw. I watched the monitor, waiting for the expected physiological response: elevated stress levels, heart rate spikes, changes in posture. Instead, I saw something else. Its fists tightened, its muscles tensed, but not in fear. It was resisting. Not in the way lesser beings do, not in blind panic or futile struggle. This was controlled, deliberate. It was fighting the device as if it understood exactly what I was trying to do and refused to allow it. Then, to my utter shock, it smiled. A slow, deliberate, knowing smile. Something was very wrong. I deactivated the device immediately. The human exhaled slowly, rolling its shoulders as if shaking off the sensation. It had won, and worse, it knew it. I had seen creatures struggle before, had witnessed defiance and desperation, but I had never encountered anything like this. It wasn't afraid of me. It was waiting. I had underestimated it. At first, I thought it was adjusting, accepting its place within my collection. It had stopped openly resisting, no longer ignoring the food or sitting in sullen defiance. It ate, moved around the enclosure, even seemed to explore its limited environment with idle curiosity. I should have known then that something was wrong. The first sign came when the security log showed a minor fluctuation in the containment field's power levels. It was insignificant, barely a fraction of a second of instability, something I might have overlooked had I not been so meticulous in my work. Still, I made a mental note to investigate later. Then the alarm sounded. I woke to flashing emergency lights, my control panel blaring a warning. Containment breach detected. Specimen 47 unaccounted for. Impossible. I rushed to the enclosure, expecting to find some technical failure, some fluke that had allowed the human to escape. Instead, I found the security field deactivated, the interior of the containment unit empty. A small panel at the base of the enclosure had been removed, not torn open in panic, not forced apart with brute strength, but carefully unscrewed. That was when the second alarm triggered. I spun toward my console, pulling up the internal surveillance feed. There it was, moving through the corridors of my ship with unsettling ease. It was fast, impossibly fast for something of its size, slipping through the passageways like it had studied the layout for weeks rather than days. I activated the security drones, sending them to intercept. The ship's artificial intelligence calculated its path predicting its movements with cold efficiency. There were only so many places it could go, only so many options available to it. It had no weapons, no allies, no means of escaping into space, yet, deep in my core, I felt something close to unease. It wasn't running blindly. It was thinking. I followed its progress, watching as it ducked into maintenance shafts, moving with unsettling precision. It anticipated the drones before they arrived, bypassed security locks as if it had memorized the codes. That should have been impossible. The only explanation was that it had been studying my ship, learning its functions in secret. For 3 hours, I hunted it. 3 hours. No mere pet, no simple animal should have lasted more than 10 minutes. It used my ship against me, triggering false alarms, locking me out of my own systems in brief, maddening intervals. It wasn't just escaping. It was testing me. Finally, I cornered it near the auxiliary docking bay, sealing the exits before it could slip away again. It stood there, chest rising and falling with exertion, eyes locked onto mine. And then it did something that made my blood run cold. It laughed. A low, quiet chuckle, barely audible over the hum of the ship's systems. Not nervous, not panicked, amused. Realized then that I had made a mistake. A terrible, terrible mistake. "You think I'm an animal?" The words came from its mouth, smooth and controlled, the translation device embedded in my auditory receptors, processing them instantly. I hesitated. I had known the human-possessed language. I had recorded its mutterings in the enclosure, catalogued the strange cadences of its speech. But this was different. This was not the rambling of a confused captive, nor the desperate plea of a creature realizing its fate. This was calculated, measured. It had chosen this moment to speak. "I am the master here," I said, regaining my composure. "You are property. You will obey." It smiled. That same maddening expression from before, the one that didn't belong, on the face of a lesser being. A look of amusement. A look of confidence. "Funny," it said. "You're the one who looks trapped," I bristled, mandibles clicking together in irritation. The notion was absurd. I was the one in control. I had cornered it, cut off its escape routes, locked it behind layers of reinforced barriers. My ship, my technology, my rules. Yet as I looked at the security monitors, a sliver of doubt crept into my mind. The auxiliary docking bay was an empty chamber used primarily for emergency evacuations. There was no way off the ship from here. No transport, no external hatch that could be accessed without authorization. But the human had led me here. It had not fled aimlessly, had not thrown itself at the first opportunity for escape. It had manipulated me into following it, guiding me away from the ship's core systems, away from the control center where I had the most power. I tightened my grip on the energy baton at my side, a weapon I rarely needed to use. "You will return to your enclosure. You have wasted enough of my time." "Or what?" the human asked. The words were not defiant, not angry, just curious, as if it genuinely wanted to know what I would do next. I activated the baton with a sharp hum, the energy crackling along its length. I had no intention of harming it permanently. Damage reduced the value of a specimen, but a reminder of my authority was necessary. It didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head slightly, as if analyzing the weapon, as if cataloguing it the same way I had catalogued it. "Do you even understand what you've done?" it asked. I narrowed my eyes. I have captured a rare species, one that will serve as an example of my expertise in... It exhaled sharply. A laugh, but not one of humor, a laugh of disbelief. "You didn't just capture me," it said. "You captured a human." I started to respond, but something about the way it spoke made me pause. Not the words themselves, but the weight behind them, a certainty, a warning, as if I had unleashed something I did not yet understand. Days passed, and the human's behavior changed. It no longer tested the physical limits of its enclosure, no longer resisted its containment. It ate when food was provided, exercised. Within the small space I had allotted it, even responded to simple verbal prompts when I addressed it. To any outside observer, it would seem as though it had finally accepted its place. But I knew better. The change was not submission. It was something else, something far more unsettling. It was learning. The security malfunctions began soon after. At first, they were small, a flickering monitor, a delayed response in the automated logs, an unnoticed shift in environmental controls. I dismissed them as minor glitches, insignificant anomalies in a complex system. Then, the ship's core functions began misaligning. Navigation settings were recalibrated when no command had been given. Security protocols deactivated for brief, inexplicable moments, only to reactivate as if nothing had changed. Life support parameters were altered, never enough to cause immediate harm, but just enough that I noticed. I suspected sabotage, perhaps an outside force, an undetected breach in my defenses. I initiated deep system scans, encrypted all essential pathways, ensured that only I had access to the ship's primary operations. And yet the malfunctions continued. It was not until I reviewed the surveillance logs that I understood the gravity of my mistake. The human had not stopped resisting. It had simply shifted tactics. I watched in growing horror as the recordings played. The human moved differently now, deliberately, methodically. It observed everything, its eyes tracing the smallest details of its surroundings. Every time I entered its enclosure, it tracked my movements, noted the devices I used, the panels I accessed, and then there was the moment that made my blood run cold. The footage showed it pacing, then stopping before one of the embedded wall terminals. It did not touch the screen, did not interact with it directly. Instead, it simply watched. Hours passed. It studied the glow of the interface, the rhythm of the automated responses. It was memorizing the system. I had always assumed its intelligence was limited. No species at its level of development could possibly grasp the complexities of a Zalari ship's architecture. And yet here it was, dismantling my control, not through force, but through understanding. I turned from the monitor, already moving toward its enclosure. I had to reinforce security, had to contain it before. The lights flickered. The ship's automated voice chimed in my ears. Command override detected, auxiliary systems rerouting. My stomach tightened. That command should have been impossible. I had locked down all external access. No one could bypass the security layers without my authorization. No one except I turned back to the monitor. The enclosure was empty. The security door had been opened from the inside, and the human was gone. The war did not begin with a declaration. There were no demands, no warnings, no diplomatic overtures. It began with silence. At first, it was only whispers among the collectors, unconfirmed reports of missing specimens, unexplained ship malfunctions, entire collections vanishing without a trace. Rumors spread that humans had escaped captivity, that they were organizing. It was absurd. They were primitives, barely spacefaring, too few in number to be of any consequence. Then the first confirmed attack came. A Zalari research vessel, renowned for its catalogue of rare species, was found adrift in deep space. No distress signal, no signs of external damage. When salvagers boarded the ship, they found it eerily intact, untouched except for one critical detail. Every human specimen was missing. The security logs had been wiped, the containment units were empty, and the crew slaughtered, not in the brutal, reckless manner of pirates or raiders, but with chilling efficiency. Vital systems had been sabotaged, oxygen vents sealed, artificial gravity disabled at critical moments. The ship's personnel had been killed without a single shot fired. That was when the collectors began to panic. It was not an isolated event. One by one, ships and facilities that had taken humans began to fall silent. Some vanished entirely. Others were found abandoned, stripped of all research data related to their human captives. Entire starports were placed on high alert, governments quietly reinforcing their security protocols. Still, the Galactic authorities refused to acknowledge the truth. The Zalari Empire had existed for millennia, its control over trade and biological research uncontested. The idea that a fledgling species, one that had barely touched the stars, could pose a real threat was laughable until the first fleet fell. I watched the battle unfold through intercepted transmissions. A Zalari enforcement squadron, one of our finest, had been dispatched to a remote sector where human escapees had reportedly been gathering. Their ships were superior in every way, faster, more heavily armed, commanded by veterans of countless conquests. Against any reasonable foe, they would have crushed the resistance in mere hours. But the humans did not fight like any foe we had encountered before. They did not rely on conventional strategies, did not adhere to the structured warfare of the Galactic empires. They fought like a species that had spent its entire existence surviving against stronger, faster, deadlier predators. Their ships, crude, improvised, seemingly held together by sheer determination, moved unpredictably, exploiting weaknesses in our formations that should not have existed. They did not attack head-on. They infiltrated, disabled, dismantled. They turned our own technology against us. One by one, our ships went dark. Weapons refused to fire. Engines failed mid-combat. Our forces, trained for direct engagement, were picked apart from within. And, when the last transmission came through, garbled and full of panicked screams, I finally understood. We had made a mistake, a great mistake, and there would be no mercy. I no longer considered myself a collector. What was once a title of prestige, a mark of my skill in acquiring and cataloguing the rarest life forms in the galaxy, had become meaningless. There was nothing left to collect, nothing left to study. The humans had seen to that. I sat in the dim glow of my failing console, the once pristine control center of my ship, now a tomb. Warnings flashed across the screen, oxygen levels critically low, power reserves nearly depleted, distress beacon disabled. Not that it mattered. No one was coming. They had made sure of that. It had happened so quickly. What had started as an anomaly, an impossible fluke, had spread like a virus. Humans had escaped captivity in every known sector, their numbers swelling as they liberated their own kind. And then, without ceremony, without grand proclamations, they had waged their war not for conquest, not for territory, for vengeance. The great empires, the mighty collectors, the proud scientists who had once viewed them as nothing more than an oddity to be studied, dissected, and displayed, they had all been undone. Their fleets sabotaged, their security compromised, their worlds infiltrated. The humans did not strike like conquerors, they struck like survivors, like something that had spent its entire history enduring, adapting, winning. We had thought them weak because they lacked natural armor, because they were soft-fleshed and small. We had believed their emotions, their attachments, to be vulnerabilities. We had mistaken their curiosity, their stubborn defiance for foolishness, but there was one truth we had failed to grasp. Humans do not submit, they endure. I had seen them survive impossible conditions, resist psychological manipulation, and adapt to environments that should have broken them. I had watched as they learned, faster than any species I had encountered, absorbing information with terrifying speed. And now I was seeing the final result of my mistake. A faint clatter echoed through the corridors outside my chamber. I stiffened, my secondary arms reaching for the control panel, but there was nothing left to command. My systems were dead, my ship was dead, and I was next. The door slid open, and there it stood, the first human I had captured, no longer a captive, no longer a specimen. It stepped forward, moving with the same deliberate confidence it had shown from the beginning. There was no rage in its eyes, no hatred, just cold certainty. I wanted to speak, to beg, to explain that I had not known, that I had never intended for things to go this far. But I saw in its expression that it did not matter. Humans did not keep pets, they did not belong in cages, and they never forgot. As the human raised its weapon, I closed my eyes and accepted the truth. Had made the greatest mistake in the history of the galaxy, and now it was time to pay the price.